He thought he had a normal life. A steady job. 2 kids who laughed too loud. A house that smelled like coffee and crayons. A wife who kissed him at the door and left sticky notes on the computer. Simple. Ordinary. Safe. Until a sticky note with a password on it made a man's world tilt. Imagine sitting at a kitchen table, watching your life on a screen, and seeing the parts of it you trusted, the places you put your heart, being quietly stolen. Not in a Hollywood scene of shouting and slamming doors, but in emails, motel receipts, and the day-to-day deception of someone you built everything around. That's where this story begins. Not with a confrontation. Not with a dramatic discovery shouted down a hallway. It starts with a quiet suspicion, a printed page taped inside a folder, and a decision that will change 4 lives forever. If you want to hear how one man took the slow, surgical route to revenge, how he reused the weapons of exposure and truth to reduce a man's life to courtroom filings and eviction notices, then stay with this story. This is not about violence. It's about control. About consequences. About making sure the person who broke a family remembers what he did, every single day. Beat. Music rises and settles. This is the story of betrayal, of a father's fury turned to cold calculation, and of how karma doesn't always come fast. Sometimes it arrives in documents, in bank accounts, and in the slow collapse of everything someone thought secure. Before we dive in, if you love true stories of cold revenge and poetic justice, hit like and subscribe. If this one gives you goosebumps, share it with someone who can't get enough of satisfying payback. And comment below, if you were him, what's the one thing you'd expose first? Alright. Let's rewind. In the early 2000s, the house sat like any other on an ordinary suburban block, mailbox leaning a little, a swing set in the backyard, a kid's bicycle abandoned by the curb. Inside, the routine was the kind that builds quiet trust. He worked. She worked part-time. They split the chaos of kids, car seats, homework. Their children, 4 and 6, were in the perfect age of honest smallness. They still told the truth in bursts, about the lost soccer ball, about the frog in the yard, about the scary thunderstorm. He would have sworn his life was unremarkable and safe. But the safety of ordinary life is a fragile thing. It depends on shared facts: who's at home, who's at work, who's asleep on the couch. It depends on small signals, a note on a monitor, a familiar ringtone, the way a kid's laugh echoes down a hallway. And when those small signals start to mismatch, that brittle web of trust begins to tremble. He noticed the first tremor in mileage. It was a small detail, an extra 40, then 80 miles on a week. But those miles add up. In his head they formed a pattern: daycare pickup, a long drive to a different house, return in time for dinner. She told him the kids had stayed at her parents' so she could work or run an errand. It made sense on paper. But something about the cadence of explanations didn't. So he watched. He's not a detective by trade. He's a father who kept receipts, logged dates in a notebook, and counted miles like currency. He added them up. A few hundred miles a week. 90 minutes between houses. A repetition. A rhythm. Then a sticky note with a password clicked his attention like a physical switch. He sat at the computer. The sticky wasn't meant for him. It was for convenience. A hurried scribble of a username and a password. The temptation is small sometimes. A peek. A glance. Most people respect that boundary. But when suspicion has the taste of iron in your mouth, it makes you reckless. He opened the inbox she used years ago. An AOL account, relic of another era, and scrolled. At first he saw nothing but shopping confirmations, a reminder about volunteer hours, small day-to-day noise. Then he found something else: long, Slack emails between her and a college friend. Not jokes. Not planning. The words fell like cold drops. She described meetings with an old boyfriend. She joked about his wife. She named the motel. He printed them. He folded the printouts like holy evidence. He had to know more. Pride rarely leaves a man to fall on his knees. Instead, this man called a cop friend, someone who listened without judgment but with directness. The cop suggested a private investigator. It was not dramatic. It was necessary. He didn't want guesswork. He wanted facts. The PI, Ron, had been a cop who'd moved into private work. Ron had patience and smell for patterns. He took the emails, the dates, the suspicion, and he moved. What Ron delivered was not just an accumulation of sightings. It was a dossier, photos of the wife's car in the motel lot time-stamped, lunch receipts with signatures, a detailed itinerary of how she'd take the kids to her parents' house, drive across town for lunch, vanish for a few hours, then return for pickup. And the lover? Ron found him, too. Bob, a VP of sales for his father-in-law's business, married with 3 children. Public-facing, respectable. A man with a career, a reputation built into a family business. Everything that had been brittle and suspicious snapped into clean, cold lines on paper. This was no misread. This was deception with schedule and pattern. The man felt his stomach empty. Not the heat of rage so much as a bone-deep cold. That emptiness is more dangerous because it gives you clarity. Clarity is surgical. It lets the mind move from reaction to plan. His parents had a history that made the decision personal. He'd watched a childhood broken by infidelity, bedrooms turned into battlegrounds, holidays ruined by whispered betrayals, and children who learned that home could become fragile overnight. He could not let his kids pay that cost again. So he hired a divorce lawyer. It wasn't about drama. It was about protection, of his children, their future stability, and of himself. Law is a tool. It levels public and private into paperwork and deeds. But there was more. He had evidence. If the affair was only a private wound, he could walk away. If it involved another family, a man with a wife and children, he could expose more than the lie. He could bring consequences to the person who had broken another home. He asked Ron for an extra favor: find the lover's wife, and show her the truth. For execution, the quiet exposure. The day came like a quiet storm. He had his wife served at work. Not a scene in the driveway. Not a scandal in a restaurant. A lawyer's hand, a process server's paper, a hushed conversation in an office hallway. Divorce papers. The kind that do not ask permission. The kind that announce a decision. At the same time, Ron knocked on the lover's door. He showed the wife the motel photos, the lunch receipts, the times and dates. He laid out the email printouts. She stared at the paper like someone watching their life change temperature. What happened next was human and messy and perfectly ordinary. She emptied joint bank accounts. She took the kids and left. She told her father what had happened, and in this case, the father was the boss. The lover worked for his father-in-law's company. Family businesses have skeletal systems of loyalty. A son's betrayal is both moral and corporate. The fallout was immediate and exponential. The lover was fired. The house? Owned by his in-laws. Eviction followed. Courtrooms filled with filings. Custody fights erupted. Public documents recorded the slow implosion. There were other things the man later learned: fights that escalated to police reports, a nose broken in an enraged confrontation, and criminal charges that tasted of desperation. Bob was no longer anywhere he could be easily found. He left the state. He became an absence on the internet, a name scrubbed from Facebook, a professional profile erased. All of this was not violence. It was exposure and consequence. It was legal, procedural, and painfully effective. The lover's life, career, marriage, home, unraveled because of the ripple effects of truth. Why did this feel so satisfying? Not because humiliation is sweet. Not because a man's downfall is a joy. The satisfaction came from a return to balance. He had been betrayed. He had been lied to. The affair wasn't a private wound but a theft in plain sight, a theft that used his children as cover. What he did was expose the theft. He didn't invent misery. He simply returned the consequences of deception to their rightful owners. There's something deeply human about consequences that fit the crime. The lover had built his life on a charade. When the charade collapsed, he lost not only what he had taken, a married woman's affection, but the stable scaffolding of family and work that had supported him. That collapse felt, to onlookers, like proportional justice. The man did not shout victory. He did not plot a public spectacle. He did what was necessary and let the legal and social consequences do the rest. In the quiet after the storm, life reassembled itself in a different geometry. He and his ex negotiated custody, and their interactions reduced to the logistics of parenting. The pain didn't vanish. It thinned, turned into something coarser, practical, like worn leather. He loved his kids. He showed up. He did the errands. He answered questions he didn't always want to. His ex? She remained important to him only because she was the mother of his children. They didn't rekindle what had been lost. They built a new kind of relationship, civil, functional, necessary. Bob? Gone. The records show trials, filings, and a string of events that ruined what he had built. He left the state, his reputation in tatters. The last whispers of him are in court dockets and in a few neighbors' memories. The man's victory was not a headline. It was small, stable things, his children graduating high school without the chaos that had fractured his childhood. It was a life rebuilt with boundaries. The payoff in this story is not a shouted confrontation. It is the accumulation of consequences. It is the way the world rearranged itself around truth. Imagine the lover, once smiling in boardrooms, being escorted out of his father-in-law's business. Imagine eviction notices arriving on his doorstep, documents that say this is no longer your home. Picture custody hearings that turn private indiscretion into public testimony. This is the slow thud of life being dismantled. Then imagine him in the small hours, drunk on regret, a hand pressed to a bruised nose, standing outside a house that is no longer his. That is a vivid, human image, small, pathetic, and gut-wrenching. But the real climax is a quieter scene, the man standing in a courtroom as formal documents, the kind that codify loss, are read and filed. Their tone is antiseptic. Words like dissolution and custody fall like a final sentence. The lover's life is recorded in ink now. It's undeniable. The husband watches, not with glee but with a heavy calm. He watches because he needed the truth to be known. He watches because exposing the lie created a legal record that prevents future denials. The payoff is the system doing what it was meant to do, assigning consequences where wrongs occurred. There's one more image that lingers: the lover's wife at her desk in the company she eventually took over after her father retired. She rebuilt. She worked, she earned, and she recovered. The lover's betrayal did not destroy everyone. In some ways, it liberated her, pushed her into a role she hadn't expected. The return on exposure was complex, pain, yes, but also reorientation. That complexity is the moral center of this story. The man didn't want someone's life destroyed for the joy of it. He wanted accountability. And in returning consequences to deceit, he preserved the future for his children. Years later, the man might tell you he doesn't hate his ex. He doesn't spend nights plotting. He spends his time being a father. That's the point. Revenge that saves the future for the innocent is less about cruelty and more about prevention. Some people say revenge is small, others say it's necessary. This story occupies that uncomfortable middle ground. It's not about vengeance in the cinematic sense. It's about making sure the cost of betrayal is real, not because the man enjoyed seeing another crumble, but because his childhood had been devastated by infidelity, and he had vowed not to let his children inherit that same ruin. He rebuilt. He guarded his family. He taught his kids what stability looks like after the storm. He learned that exposure, when done with care and legality, can be a kind of medicine, bitter but helpful. So what's the lesson? If someone breaks the trust that holds a home, the response can be measured and effective. You don't need to burn bridges to the ground in a fit of rage. You can document, expose, and let the systems in place, legal, social, familial, assign the consequences. That's a kind of power. And it's one that rarely makes good television but often saves lives. If this story left you stunned, hit like and let me know below what you would have done. Have you ever uncovered a betrayal like this? How did you react? Tell us in the comments. The best true stories are the ones shared by you. If you want more deeply satisfying revenge stories narrated like this, quiet, surgical, and true, subscribe and ring the bell. We bring you real Reddit confessions where consequences are carved out with patience, not pyrotechnics. Thanks for listening. Remember, truth is a small, powerful thing. Hold it carefully.